It may be noted in passing that Kant usually addresses himself not to the statement that all experience is temporally ordered, but rather to certain more specific statements about time, such as that it is one-dimensional. He also thinks that arithmetic relates to time as geometry does to space, so that the a priority of 5 plus 7 equals 12 is secured by the form of inner sense. This part of Kant's theory is wrong in a thoroughly boring way. I shall ignore it. Time must be one-dimensional. Presents, I think, fewer problems than all experience must be temporal. There is no way of satisfying the conditions for temporality without satisfying the conditions for one-dimensional temporality. So that time is one-dimensional is, although not elementarily analytic, a conceptual truth of the same unobvious kind as all outer experience is spatial. We can then understand Kant's calling it synthetic and a priori. Illustrating his axioms of time, Kant says, according to Kant's translation, time has only one dimension. Different times are not simultaneous but successive. This looks like a pair of axioms, and it is puzzling that Kant should regard the second of them as synthetic rather than as elementarily analytic. Surely the statement that T1 is simultaneous with T2 is just the statement that T1 is T2. The fact is, though, that in the quoted passage Kant thinks he is propounding not two axioms but one. Where Kant's has a semicolon, Kant uses a colon so that the passage has the force of time as only one dimension. In other words, different times are not simultaneous but successive. It is therefore natural for Kant to regard the second clause as synthetic, since he thinks it is equivalent to the first. The two clauses do not make the same point. The rather persistent belief that they do may be based on the assumption that if times were ordered two-dimensionally in columns and rows, as it were, then two times could be distinct because occupying different columns, and yet be simultaneous because occupying the same row. This, however, assumes that there is one obviously right way of fitting the notion of simultaneity into the barely coherent supposition that time might be two-dimensional, and that is just false. Kant's own reasons for thinking that time has only one dimension makes the same point as different times are not simultaneous but successive is even more certainly wrong. Here is his whole sentence. Time has only one dimension. Different times are not simultaneous but successive, just as different spaces are not successive but simultaneous. The antithesis which follows the colon is clearly supposed to express the difference of dimensionality between space and time, but it does not such thing. When Kant says that different spaces are simultaneous, he means that different parts of space exist at the same time. And this will be no less true if space had only one dimension. In short, in the sense in which it is true that different spaces may be simultaneous while different times cannot. This is not because of a difference of dimensionality, but because spaces has last through time while times do not. 17. concepts and intuitions. I remarked in 1 that the boundary between the static and the logic is based upon a distinction between sense and intellect. Now, intellect is not one of Kant's technical terms, but many aspects of the human condition usually covered by that vague word are classified by Kant as activities of the understanding. Kant says there's two stems of human knowledge, namely sensibility and understanding. Through the former, objects are given to us. Through the latter, they are thought. Through the sensibility, that is, we are presented with all our factual raw material. It will be a fair gloss on through sensibility objects are given to us. To say that it is through sensibility that we establish truths about what there is. The understanding, in the other hand, enable us to organize intellectually our raw material by classifying, discriminating, judging, comparing. Some more technical terminology. Sensibility alone yields us intuitions. From the understanding arise concepts. For Kant, an intuition is just a sensory state. To have an intuition is to be in a sensory state, and to have an intuition of something is to be sensorily aware of it. One way of having an intuition of a man, for example, for example, is to see a man. To have the concept of a man or of humanity is not to be in any kind of sensory state. It is just to be able to recognize man as man, to distinguish man from apes, to know that a man cannot be a vegetable, and so on. To have a concept is to be able to do certain things, particularly linguistic things, such as answering questions like, is this a man? And why is that not a man? The claim that to have a concept is to have an ability, and the related claim that to analyze a concept is to clarify the proper use of certain expressions, and thus to describe the ability to use them properly, might be condensed into the statement that a concept is an ability. This is an ellipsis, for it does not carry over literally into our talk or of applying concepts, or of concepts as being imprecious, general, and the like. Still, it is a convenient ellipsis, and I shall avail myself of it. In crediting Kant, with the view that a concept is an ability or skill, I may have flattered him. For his position may be rather than having a concept is being in a mental state which endows one with certain abilities. Wittgenstein has given excellent reasons for classifying concepts and abilities, and for denying that there is any distinguishable mental state which is the concept and which leads to the abilities. Kant might not want to go as far as this. As I noted in 2, his explanation of analyticity suggests that the concept of body can be found to include that of extension by the act of thinking, or conjuring up the former concept and introspecting it. Also, Kant uses the one-word representation to cover both intuitions and concepts, and thus suggests that concepts like intuitions are discrete, debatable mental items of some kind. Yet, whether or not Kant thinks that concepts are the causes of, rather than identical with, certain capacities, his actual working use of concept is, except when he is explaining analyticity, rather thoroughly Wittgensteinian. For him, as for Wittgenstein, the interest of concepts lies in the abilities with which they are somehow associated. Kant's mild tendency to think of concepts as introspectible particulars does not, at any rate, take the pernicious form of identifying concepts with something in the nature of sensory states. Some philosophers have said that intellectual activity is the manipulation of ideas, which are mental particulars pretty much like sense data. Descartes and Locke uses the word idea to stand indifferently for sense data and for whatever one has in mind when one thinks or understands. Spinoza assimilated sensing to thinking. Seeing something happen is, in his view, a mental operation which does not differ in kind from drawing a conclusion. Hume assimilated thinking to sensing. According to his theory of belief, to judge that the sun is shining is vividly to picture the shining sun. Not only Spinoza versus Hume, but also Leibniz versus Locke, as Kant saw. Leibniz intellectualized appearances just as Locke sensualized all concepts of understanding, with the possible expectation of the captor of schematism. The critic is completely free of both rationalists and empiricists, of both rationalist and empiricist forms of the conflation of the sensory with the intellectual. It is not hard to see that being in a sensory state differs from having certain linguistic and other skills, but the insight that the distinction between sensory states and concepts of this sort was an achievement which cannot be truly appreciated until one has read Kant's predecessors. And then we can see how beguiling and up to a point, how astonishingly serviceable is the view that concepts and sensory states are species of a single genus, differing from one another not at all, Berkeley, or differing only in degree of clarity, Descartes, or reliability, Spinoza, or the tiledness, Locke, or vividness, Hume. Like Berkeley before him, Kant thinks it's important to say that thinking is something we do like sense, we do, while sensing is something which happens to us. His simple alignment of the active-passive dichotomy with the understanding-sensibility dichotomy underlies a crucial aspect of his use of the word intuition. He applies intuition not only to any individual sensory state, but also to the capacity for being in such states. In the latter use, intuition looks interchangeable with sensibility, but this is not quite so. By intuition, Kant means capacity for being confronted by individual items of reality, and by sensibility he means passive intuition. Since the only intuition humans have is, Kant thinks, a passive or sensible one. The words intuition and sensibility are interchangeable in the human context. the former referring to confrontation with data, the latter adding a reference to passivity. Kant allows that there could be beings with nonsensible intuition, an example with a faculty A which confronts them with particulars as our sense to us, and B in respect of which they are active as, according to Kant, we are in respect of our understanding but not our intuition. A non-sensible intuition will presumably be a capacity for acting informatively, whatever that may mean. Kant emphasizes that although such an intuition is consistently supposable, we cannot even speculate about what it will be like. We cannot take Kant's non-sensible intuition as a precisely located possibility, because the thesis which underlies it, namely that our intuition is passive and our understanding active, is at best a drastic oversimplification. For example, when I raise my arm, I actively produce changes in my sensory state. Yet Kant will not count physical activity as an exercise of non-sensible intuition. He might plead that what really happens when I raise my arm is that I actively do something which involves no sensory changes. And that sensory changes then occur as consequences of that initial action. But this reduces the initial action to something entirely non-physical, volition, presumably. And that way confusion lies. Or again, what about imagination? Kant himself says that this is an active faculty and that it confronts us with intuitions. But he will not admit that it is a kind of non-sensible intuition. Given the unclarity of his active-passive dichotomy, one simply cannot say whether or how he could avoid such an admission. The notion of non-sensible intuition is important because of its connection with the notion of a noumenon, to which I now return. 18. The negative use of noumenon. While Kant denies that we can apply to noumena any determinate predicate or any of the concepts of the understanding, he yet holds that they are possible and that we can think them. How can a possibility be indescribable? And how can we think something except with the concepts of the understanding? In answer, Kant introduces the negative use of noumenon. The concept of a noumenon is a merely limiting concept, the function of which is to curb the pretensions of sensibility, and it is therefore only a negative employment. Presumably, curbing the pretensions of sensibility is indicating the limits of what sensibility can do, likely word for a limiting concept. I take it that the limit of sensibility is expressed by any true synthetic statement of the form all our sensory states are F, or none of our sensory states are F. The restriction to synthetic truth seems reasonable. One will not want to say that our experience is limited, to the extent that none of our sensory states is a perception of something red and not colored, or to the extent that all our sensory states are accompanied by consciousness. On the other hand, it is reasonable to say that our experience is limited to the extent that all our auditory states are of sounds which fall within a certain range of pitch. Perhaps some could satisfy himself that this is a genuine limit on his experience by imagining or hearing in his mind's ear sounds which are now too high for us, but something can be a genuine limit without our being able in this way to imagine ourselves free of it. I cannot see in my mind's eye a fourth primary color, yet such a radical addition to my visual range is possible. It is not logically necessary that the color range I know is complete. Furthermore, I can say something about what it will be like for a new primary color to be seen, for I know how I might satisfy myself that someone else could see one, the things he might say and how he might fit them in. We talk about other colors. Now I have argued in effect that all our experience is temporal, thus set a genuine limit to our experience. Yet we are unable to imagine having a temporal experience, and we cannot even say how we might know of someone else that he had a temporal experience or apprehended and a temporal reality. In this one case, the notion of a limit cannot be elucidated by an account of what will be involved in the limits being removed, and yet it is a genuine limit for all that. In its negative use, noumenon serves as a reminder that there are facts about our experience which impose limits on what we can meaningfully say. When Kant says that a temporal reality will be noumenal, he's saying that we can have no vocabulary, no concepts with which to describe such a reality. When he allows that the concept of a noumenon is possible, he's saying, among other things, that it is not in the ordinary way analytically necessary that all data are temporal. If this interpretation is right, Kant's negative use of noumenon is no longer bewildering. It does remain queer and strained, but only because the point it is making about the place of temporality in our experience and our conceptual scheme, it is itself difficult and peculiar. Kant's point here is a good one, but the fact is that he does not make it by means of a use, even a negative use of the concept of a noumenon. When he makes it best, he talks about the concept of a noumenon rather than using it in talk about noumena. What he says does not take the dangerous form. There might be noumena, but we have no concepts for them. Rather, he says something like the statement, there might be noumena, but we have no concepts for them, serves as a reminder that our sensibility has limits which restrict what we can mean, and which therefore cannot be shown to be limits in the usual way, namely by describing their removal. Such second-order uses of noumenon are all that Kant needs. Indeed, what he wants to say can be said entirely without any such words as noumenon, viz., by simply describing the place which temporality has in our conceptual scheme. A graver mistake in Kant's handling of noumenon affecting the whole critique can be found in condensed form in the chapter of phenomena and noumena. I have remarked that Kant equates the nominal with what lies outside the reach of our kind of intuition, and I have taken the atemporal as the only plausible example I could find. Now for Kant, our kind of intuition is passive, sensible, and so an intuition not of our kind will be active, intellectual. He says that we cannot comprehend even the possibility of intellectual intuition, but possibly is there used in a strong sense. Kant does think that intellectual intuition is a self-consistent phrase, and the vital point he assumes that what lies beyond the reach of our kind of intuition is what could be known by an intellectual intuition if there were one. Any being has a temporal data if and only if its intuition is intellectual. Kant is presumably drawn to the phrase intellectual intuition by its architectonic efficiency. An intellectual intuition will be a faculty which presented one with data but which was otherwise just like our understanding. It will in fact be an understanding which will knows its object, not discursively through categories, but intuitively in a non-sensible intuition. Thus our intuition is not intellectual, makes the same point as it may by our understanding does not give us data, but only enables us to handle data reaching us from another source. And so two major Kantian emphases are really one. To put the point teasingly, the passiveness of our intuition is the uniformativeness of our understanding. This last formulation gives the game away. Clearly, the active-passive dichotomy it is still more suspect alignment with the intellectual sensible dichotomy are here put under a theoretical load which they cannot possibly support. Even if we grant, which I do not, that something clear and true is said by our intuition is passive, but there might be an intuition which was active as our understanding is. And even if we allow Kant to use intellectual to mean active, it still does not follow that an active intuition will be intellectual, in the other sense of being a capacity for the intellectual control of data. And so it does not follow that an active intuition will be an intuitive understanding. Worse follows. For Kant takes intellectual intuition to be free not just from the limits of human intuition, but from all limits whatsoever. Sensible intuition presents us with things as they appear. Intellectual intuition will present them as they are in themselves. Early in the Critic, Kant says, if we abstract from our mode of intuition and so take objects as they may be in themselves, then time is nothing. The caution expressed by my be is later thrown to the winds. If the senses represent to us something merely as it appears, this something must also in itself be a thing, and an object of a non-sensible intuition, that is, of the understanding. In other words, a kind of knowledge must be possible in which there is no sensibility and which alone has reality that is absolutely objective. Through its object will be represented as they are, whereas in the empirical employment of our understanding, things will be known only as they appear. In another passage in which this same line of thought emerges through a dramatical chaos, Kant says that in calling things phenomena, we distinguish the mode in which we intuit them from the nature that belongs to them in themselves, and that this distinction implies the notion of possible things, which are not objects of our senses, but are true as objects merely through the understanding, things which can be called intelligible in entities, noumena. This use of thought, like that in Kant's reference to the concept of a noumenon, that is, of a thing which is not to be thought as object of the senses, but as a thing in itself, solely through a pure understanding, points to another architectonic flourish. Noumena are intelligible. They could be known only through an intellectual intuition, but even we who have no such intuition can think them. Appearances, so far as they are thought as objects according to the unity of the categories, are called phenomena. But if I postulate things which are mere objects of understanding, and which nevertheless can be given as such to an intuition, although not to one that is sensible, such things will be entitled noumena. I cannot find, however, any clear route from "we can only think them" to "only if we had an intellectual intuition could we know them." In any case, what is it that we are supposed to be able to think? If noumenon merely points to the unamplifiable logical possibility that there should be a temporal data, then perhaps we can think noumena. But things as they are in themselves is quite another matter. I can find no sense in talk about a mode of knowing, intellectual or otherwise, which presents one with things not as they appear but as they are. Such talk seems to involve a way of knowing divorced from any possibility of saying this is how I apprehend reality, of saying I apprehend reality as a temporal, or reality appears to me as a temporal. Perhaps Kant's intention is less radical. He may intend knowledge of things as they are in themselves to amount only to a kind of knowledge which admits of no distinction between appearance and reality. If so, such knowledge need not exclude talk of how things appear or are presented, but will merely equate talk of how things appear with talk of how things are. On this interpretation of it, however, the notion of knowledge of things as they are in themselves embodies the claim that an absolutely objective reality might be apprehended in a way which did not admit of the possibility of error. This, if the objective is taken seriously, seems to be a simple mistake, and if objective is not to be taken seriously, then Kant is up against the difficulty which arises from different reasons at the end of 17. How can he deny that imagination is the intuition of things, namely images, as they are in themselves? 5. Intuitions of space and time. 19. a priori concepts and a priori intuitions. In both aesthetic and analytic, Kant seeks to prove synthetic a priori truths about all experience. Between these two sets of results, there are, he thinks, two radical differences. Firstly, the concepts of space and time must necessarily relate to objects. Only by means of such pure forms of sensibility can an object appear to us, and so be an object of empirical intuition, while the concepts treated in the analytic do not represent the conditions under which objects are given in intuition, but only those under which objects can be brought under concepts, thought about, classified, generalized over. Here, as in the next quotation, object does not mean objective particular, but has the very general sense of datum, or something given. The static then tells us all our intuitions must be like, while the analytic tells us that our intuitions must be like to be intellectually manageable. This suggests that the statics conditions might be met although the analytics were not. In example, that there might be unconceptualizable intuitions. Kant does indeed say, everything might be in such confusion that, for instance, in the series of appearances, nothing presented itself which might answer to the concept of cause and effect, which, according to the analytic, must apply to our intuitions if they are to be thinkable at all. This concept will then be empty, null, and meaningless. But since intuitions stands in no need whatsoever of the functions of thought, appearances will nonetheless present objects of our intuition. However, he intends this only as prima facie possible, as not obviously impossible. And he later argues that after all there cannot be intuitions which are not brought under concepts. In the passage just quoted, Kant is not affirming that intuition stands in no need whatsoever of functions of thought. He's putting it forward as prima facie possible, as credible to anyone who does not know the arguments for its falsity. One could unjustly say that Kant has a working picture of the aesthetic as standing what the sensibility does to institutions as they come into existence, and of the analytic as stating what the understanding does to them immediately thereafter. In place of this picture, shot through as it is with bad theory, I shall adopt one in which the aesthetic states some conditions which institutions must satisfy, and the analytic states others. The two are complementary parts of a single conceptual inquiry. There is a second way in which Kant contrasts the conclusions of the aesthetic with those of the analytic. The analytic seeks to prove that all institutions must fall under certain concepts, such as that of cause, while the conditions which the aesthetic lays down on all institutions or all other institutions do not consist primarily in obedience to concepts at all. Kant prefers to speak of institutions rather than of concepts of space and time. He even talks of space and time as being themselves institutions. We do have concepts of space and time, he allows. But he thinks that these concepts have a peculiar relationship with the corresponding institutions. In each case, the institution somehow precedes underlies and makes possible the concept. The original representation of space, Kant says, is an a priori institution, not a concept. What this comes down to as regards space is roughly the following. The static might be taken as saying, first, that spatiality is an a priori concept. Our experience must be of things which manifest a certain kind of order and so fall under the concept of spatiality. Kant, however, takes the static to be showing, second, that space is an a priori institution. Space is an a priori intuition. Our experience must be of things which occupy space, in a particular which is given in intuition, while not rejecting first Kant thinks that it is, in a way I shall explain, derived from second. All this applies mutatis mutandis to time as well. My Straussian defense of the outer sense theory has interpret in terms of first, and I do not see how one could reconstruct Strausson's argument about the concept of spatiality so as to turn it into a treatment of an intuited particular called space. Apart from his desire for a synthetic theory, therefore Kant has a further reason for denying that the static is a Strausson type exercise in conceptual analysis. We must now see why Kant takes this unpromising line about the primacy of our institutions of space and time over our concepts of spatiality and temporality. For brevity's sake, I shall make over one of Kant's formulations. Solipsism, though it is, and express the view in question in the form space and time are a priori intuitions. Most people assume that there is only one space and one time. When we speak of two spaces, we normally mean two parts of the single all-embracing space, and analogously for our talk about times. Kant thinks that it is necessary that there is only one space and one time. Any two spaces must be spatially related to one another and so be parts of a single space. And any two times must be temporally related to one another and so occur in the one and only time series. He sees that this creates a problem. The concept of an inkwell has many instances. The concept of a natural satellite of the Earth could have many. The concept of being the sole ruler of the universe cannot have more than one instance because it has singularity built in. In the first two cases, it is in no way necessary, while in the third it is analytic, that the concept has at most one instance. Kant's problem is to show how it can be necessary, though not analytic, that there is only one space and one time, and he hopes to solve this problem through his doctrine that space and time are a priori intuitions, as follows. When he says that there is only one space and one time, we are not, according to Kant, saying of general concepts of space and time that they have only one instance each. we are not dealing with general concepts at all, because space and time are not descriptive expressions but proper names. There is only one space does not have the logical form of there is only one great German philosopher. It is logically nearer to there is only one Immanuel Kant. Similarly, with there is only one time. In terms of the proper name, space, Kant permits us to define a peculiar kind of general term, spatial, or a space. This being so defined that X is spatial or X is a space means X is a part of space. Describing X as a spatial or as a space then is not saying that X manifests a certain kind of order. Rather, it is doing something logically on a par with pointing to a particular, namely space, and saying X is part of that. It follows that any two spaces must be parts of space. Similarly, again, for times. This account of the logic of space and time fails to solve Kant's problem. Kant says that the intuition of space is prior to or more basic than any spatial concepts, which I interpret as saying that space is a proper name and that the general term spatial or a space must be defined in terms of it. We could grant this without granting that X is spatial, must mean that X is a part of space. For it could mean that X is like space in certain formal respects. From this definition of spatial, it simply does not follow that anything spatial must be a part of a space. Furthermore, this is a legitimate and natural way of deriving the adjective spatial from the same space. It yields, for example, the sense which I employed in considering whether all other experience must be of a spatial world. If Kant thinks that anything which is spatial in this sense must be a part of space, then he requires some fresh arguments. The claim that space is an intuition, that space is a proper name, will not do the job. Some of this applies also to the problem about the singularity of time, but a full treatment of that must wait until my next section. Kant has some moderate supplementary reasons for presenting space and time as a priori intuitions. Firstly, his transcendental idealism about space and time could be loosely summed up by saying that space and time are intuitions, not things in themselves. This does not make the same sort of point as the thesis that space and time are intuitions, not concepts, but sometimes Kant seems to think that it does. Secondly, Kant argues that if geometry is synthetic, then space must be an intuition and not a concept, because from mere concepts only analytic knowledge is to be obtained. This is just a confusion, and Kant does not even hold to it. In the Analytic, he propounds some allegedly synthetic and a priori truths about certain concepts under which all experience must fall. Finally, Kant says, pure intuition contains only the form under which something is intuited. The pure concept only the form of the thought of an object. This is suspiciously neat. Thus Kant thinks that while conditions of thinkability are concepts, conditions on intuitability must be intuitions. Surely to speak of conditions or on something is to speak of what it must be like, and that is just to speak of the concepts under which it must fall. 20. The singularity and infinity of space and time. First, 1. To begin with the singularity of space, we must distinguish the concept of a space from that of a complete space. S is a complete space. If and only if anything which is specially related to any part of S is itself a part of S. By this definition, a complete space must contain some given space S together with every space which is related to S. It need not contain all spaces there are. The concept of a complete space is not one to which Kant explicitly calls attention, but he can fairly be represented as holding the view that there can be only one complete space. A.M. Kant'S argues in his article Spaces and Times that it could become more reasonable to assert that to deny that there are two complete spaces, in example, two spaces such that no part of either relates by distance or direction to any part of the other. Suppose that one night I have a dream which is lively in its vividness, coherence, and amplitude of detail. It involves strangers as well as myself, and seems to last about 18 hours. The next night I have an equally very similar dream involving mostly the same characters and the same physical background. This continues night after night, with the dreams forming a coherently developing history, interveiled with the coherent history of my waking life. When awake, I can recall my precious dreams, and in any dream I can recall my waking life to date. It will eventually become unreasonable to say that these are dreams. They have as much right to be called experiences of reality as has my life in this world. Even conceding that what is real must be public, this conclusion stands insofar as no one else in this world has them. The dreams are admittedly private, but they contain their own public, and to divest the dream public of epistemological authority because it is only a dream public is to beg the question. The dream public might even dismiss my reports of this world as mere dream fiction, but they will be as wrong to do this as you will be to say that yours is the only real world I have been in. Alternatively, we can suppose that many people in this world share my dreams, so that one public confirms the reality of both worlds. This shows, I think, that one could alternately inhabit two distinct worlds which had equal claims to reality. Furthermore, it could be the case that there was no reason for saying that the two worlds were spatially related to one another, or no reason except the prejudice that there can be only one complete space. Quinton's story concerns the alternate occupancy of two complete spaces. But it is also possible that one should currently inhabit two spaces which have no spatial relations to one another. For example, someone might live in our world, stone deaf to all its objective noises, while also inhabiting the space of a Straussonian auditory world. If Kant's thesis is refuted neither by the alternate occupancy of two physical spaces, nor by the concurrent occupancy of a physical and an auditory space, what will refute it? Perhaps what is demanded in the concurrent occupancy of two complete physical spaces. In example, the possibility that someone should bodily inhabit our space and at the same time another tactual kinesthetic space unrelated to ours. The question now turns on whether a person could have two bodies at once. If this is not possible, then Kant's thesis on the present interpretation of it is true, but not for the reason he gives. If a person can have two bodies at once, then it is quite unclear whether Kant is right or not. That will depend on how the two-body possibility works out in detail. In working it out, we are unlikely to be helped by space is an intuition, not a concept. As regards the singularity of time, here too we need the concept of a complete time analogous to that of a complete space. Kant thinks that there can be only one complete time. In example, that there cannot be a time which is not temporally related to now. This seems to be analytic and therefore not to serve Kant's purpose. If it is analytic that everyone who is not my height is shorter or taller than me, it is not also analytic that every time other than now is neither earlier or later than now. How could a time escape being simultaneous with the present except by being past or future? It seems that the concept of a complete time, like that of the sole ruler of the universe, has singularity built in. This treatment is too glib to be final, though. Suppose it is analytic that there is only one complete time. Might not some radical shift in our experience lead us to modify our temporal concept so as to allow that there could be two distinct times which were not related to one another as earlier and later? The physics of simultaneity is irrelevant here. Granting that there need to be an absolute answer to the question, was this event simultaneous with that? I am distinguishing what might follow from a negative answer to it. Could we come to allow that two events might be determined as not simultaneous by standards which also determined that neither event preceded the other? Well, Quinton's two-space theory interferes with the metric of time but not its topology, and Quinton himself shows that his story could not be adapted to prove the possibility of two complete times. I think, furthermore, that any attempt to describe experience which would lead us to say that there were two complete times will fail as completely as the attempt to describe a temporal experience. For deep logical reasons, we are as unavoidably committed to a one-dimensional, all-inclusive time series as we are to temporality as such. Just as we cannot peel the concept of consciousness of that of a person, so we cannot strip our temporal concepts of those features which make it necessary that there is only one complete time. The reasons for this have nothing to do with times being an intuition rather than a concept. 3. Kant infers that space is an intuition rather than a concept, from the premise that space is necessarily infinite. The obscurity of this argument does not matter since its sole premise is false. Perhaps space cannot be bounded, but nevertheless it may be finite. A two-dimensional inhabitant of the surface of a sphere could learn that his space was finite, though unbounded, by discovering that although able to move where he wished, he could never break free of a certain finite region. We too could find our three-dimensional space to be finite, though unbounded, by discovering that however far and stray we traveled, all roads led to home. I have been told that this possibility is irrelevant to epistemology and metaphysics because although the space in question can be mathematically described, it cannot be concretely imagined. The word curved is sometimes invoked. Only a curved space can be finite but unbounded, and a three-dimensional space can be pictured in the mind's eye. Space cannot be pictured in the mind's eye as curved. I have delved in depth with the prejudice against cosmic possibilities which cannot be portrayed in a single picture. But there is here another mistake as well, a misunderstanding about curvature. The surface of a sphere is curved in the sense of having certain geometrical properties, which a three-dimensional space could have too. It is also curved in the untechnical sense of looking curved, feeling curved, etc. But a space which is curved in this sense must be immersed in a space of higher dimensionality, in relation to which it looks and feels curved. Now the plausibility of a three-dimensional space cannot be concretely imagined as curved. Depends upon as using a curved in this second untechnical sense, so that if A is to give support to B, three-dimensional space is not curved, then B must use curved in the untechnical sense also, but only if B uses curved in the first technical sense does not imply C. Three-dimensional space is not finite but unbounded. Therefore, on the most liberal estimate of A's relevance to B, the sense of A in which it may be true is one which makes it totally irrelevant to C. 4. Kant argues analogously from the premise that time is necessarily infinite. I have no analogous counter-arguments which shows how time might be finite, though unbounded. In my Kant's dialectic, I I shall discuss infinite, including the infinite of time, the infinity of time, more fully than I can here. That discussion will not support the view that time is an intuition rather than a concept. Analytic of concepts. Sixth, the metaphysical deduction. 21. Concepts and judgments. The analytic of concepts consists of two chapters. One is entitled The Clue to the Discovery of All Pure Concepts of the Understanding, but I shall follow the universal practice based on the in one passing remark of Kant's of referring to its main line of argument as the metaphysical deduction of the categories. The second chapter bears the equally repellent title Transcendental Deduction of the Categories. In the first chapter, Kant lays down certain conditions which he thinks must be satisfied if one is to use concepts, and in the second he argues that only someone who uses concepts can have experience, because experience must be gone through in a certain way, taken up and connected by the understanding. In this section I shall examine certain assumptions which lie behind the metaphysical deduction of the categories. Someone counts as having the concept of humanity if he can correctly use human and its cognates, or menschlich, and its cognates, human and its cognates, etc. In saying this, I treat concepts as abilities rather than as mental states which may lead to abilities. A man's ability to use a word properly does not merely suggest but proves that he has the corresponding concept. I thus desert the introspectionist approach to concepts which, as I noted in 2, Kant often adopts when he is discussing analyticity. But then Kant himself usually deserts these two. The analytic of concepts is, I think, intelligible only on the assumption that to have a concept is to have a certain sort of linguistic skill. The question of whether there can be a non-linguistic exercise of concepts will be discussed in 24. Someone who uses human and its cognates correctly, in example, in accordance with standards which are accepted by most literate speakers of English, is said to understand these words, or to know that they mean, or to know what they mean. Someone who does not know what human means may first have no use for human, or two, have a use for human but a wrong one. The two cases are very different. In type 1, cases, standards, or correctedness are crutches for beginners. In type 2, cases, they are correctives for fumblers. Type 1, cases are often stressed to the virtual exclusion of type 2, but I shall put the stress on the other way. My interest is in wrong uses of words and the normal outcome of type 1. Ignorance of the meaning of a word is not misuse, but failure to use. I shall ignore wrong uses which arise not from ignorance at all, but from someone's choosing to use a word in accordance with some purely personal standard, although he knows that the generally accepted standards are. Someone may show that he attaches a wrong meaning to a word by giving a thoroughly wrong definition of it, or by saying something which is obviously logically wrong and whose wrongness has to do with the meaning of the word in question. For example, by saying some humans are not animals, or he humans his lettuce every weekend, or to be a human is to have a brain bigger than one's stomach. But one's understanding of a word is also shown by an answerable to one's use of it in ordinary synthetic sentences. In humans sometimes laugh, as well as in humans are animals. Some philosophers seem to have thought that even the most eccentric set of assignments of true values to synthetic sentences may, however, improbably be due to misinformation rather than to a mistake about meanings. Such mishandlings of synthetic sentences, they have thought, may suggest that the speaker does not know the meaning of some words he is using, but can never show this for sure. The privilege of conclusive relevance is reversed for misuses of the word in which analytic sentences are deemed false. Self-contradictory sentences are deemed true. Nonsensical sentences are deemed meaningful. Wrong definitions are offered, and so on. It may be faintly plausible to associate the explanation of meanings with definitions, analyticities, etc. But I have suggested that we ought not to tie our theory of meaning too tightly to how meanings are explained. In example, to cures for type 1, ignorance of meanings. Whatever its sources, the view in question is in any case wrong. True value assignments to synthetic sentences may sometimes be less directly relevant to questions about meaning that are true values assignment to analytic or self-contradictory ones. But if they were never able to force a conclusion as to whether someone understands a word, we should have to allow that someone might give human in its correct meaning and yet assign the wrong true value to every synthetic sentence in which human occurs. Different kinds of sentence can be relevant in many ways and degrees to questions about meanings, and this network of relevances cannot be embodied in a precise general theory, which could mechanically answer every question about anyone's understanding of a word. But what matters for present purposes is that such questions are answerable only on the basis of true value assignments of sentences of every main sort. This or that sentence may turn out to be relevant in a given case, but no large and clearly demarked class of sentences can be ignored on principle. The relevance of this to Kant is as follows. If someone understands human and its cognates, then he has the concept of humanity, though the converse of this does not quite hold. If we agree then that someone's understanding of a word is answerable to his use of it in synthetic sentences, we are entitled to follow Kant in thinking of concepts as competence across the whole range of linguistic activity, and not just across that tiny part of it across that tiny part of it, which has to do with sentences which are or are said to be analytic or self-contradictory of meaning or meaningless. In fact, we shall see that Kant is committed to disqualifying a certain subclass of synthetic sentences from conclusive relevance to questions about meanings, but I shall argue in 36 that even this modest thesis is false. Before this matter is pursued further, I must say more about the relation between having concepts, making judgments, and knowing meanings. To have a concept is to be able to cope with. In example, generally to sort out true from false among judgments of some functional kind. I say that a class of judgments are of functional kind if and only if they do the same sort of work, have a similarity of function. The class of judgments which treat of human forms a functional kind and determines the concept of humanity, while the class of complex judgments is not associated in that way with the concept of complexity or indeed with any other concept, for complex judgments do not form a functional kind. There is no task, however, unspecific which all complex judgments perform. What counts as being able to cope with judgments and what counts as being able to cope with judgments of a functional kind, given the restriction to concepts as exercised in language and judgments as expressed in language. The best answer I can find is as follows. Someone can cope with judgments involving the concept of humanity, say, if and only if he understands sentences in some language which do the same kind of work as do English sentences containing human and its cognates, and do it in the same kind of way. This brings in as involving the concept of humanity not only various uses of other languages but also certain uses of English which do not involve humanity or any of its grammatical cognates. For example, if someone says if Hobbes' account of his own motivations were really correct, he would be one of the brutes and not one of us. The definition I have given will allow us to count this as involving the concept of humanity. When I say do the same kind of work and do it in the same kind of way, the second clause is to be understood in terms of linguistic structure. It is needed for the following reason. If a language has no short expression which could be translated as human or any of its cognates, but did contain enough morphological and behavioral adjectives for the spelling out of a lengthy description roughly equivalent in meaning to human, we should not want to say that the concept of humanity was expressed or exercised in that language, or that a user of the language that had the concept of humanity. This is because the language in question, although able to handle the fact which English handles in sentences using human and its cognates, will not be able to handle them in the same sort of way as English does. In example, will not have our device for pulling that morphological and behavioral description together under a single short expression. It will be noted that my account of the concept of humanity is given in terms of sentences using the English word human, and its cognates. This is not chauvinism, but merely reflects the fact that I have referred to the concept in question by means of an English word. Had I referred to it as the concept of Männlichkeit, it would have been suitable for me to explain it in terms of sentences containing menschlich and its cognates. And if I had taken as my prime example a concept which is not expressed or exercised in the English language, the concept of angst, say, I should necessarily have referred to it by a non-English word and explained it in terms of non-English sentences containing that word. Another special feature of my choosing example is that it concerns a single word, human. I could as well have chosen an example which has to be based, so far as English is concerned, on a short phrase and on sentences which do the same kind of work in the same kind of way as sentences containing that phrase. What I could not have done, it seems, is to give any account of what it is meant by such and such a concept or such and such a functional kind of judgment, without some references to sentences containing such and such a word or phrase. It should be remarked that, just as an expression of the form, the judgment that may not refer unambiguously to a single judgment, so an expression of the form, the concept of, may not refer unambiguously to a single concept. If the sentences in which the word W occurs due two radically different kinds of words, then the expression, the concept of W-ness, will refer to either or two concepts. The issue of how severe to be in our criterion of concept identity might be acute in a particular case, but is not so in general. There is no profit in trying to say precisely and in general that is to count as doing the same kind of work. The reason for this has to do with our reason for wanting the concept terminology at all. My rough guide is to use of concept in Kant and in philosophy generally could be improved in all sorts of ways, but not in such a way as to present concepts as a precise technical term, for it is in fact an imprecise technical term whose utility depends upon its very imprecision. An example may help to show why it is useful in philosophy to have X has the concept of as well as X knows the meaning of. Hume's discussion of causality illuminates not only cause and its cognates and their dictionary equivalents in other languages, but also such sentences as if the wound had been cauterized, gangrene would not have set in, and it is not a coincidence that left-handed parents often have left-handed children, and the evidence, though circumstantial, is overwhelming, because these do the same work as sentences containing cause and its cognates. Hume's discussion of causality, not just of cause but of the concept of cause, is relevant to them too. There is no sharp line around the sentences to which Hume's discussion of the concept of cause is relevant, and herein lies the useful imprecision of the phrase the concept of cause. More generally, there is no sharp boundary to the class of sentences which do the same sort of work as a given class of sentences. And in that fact lies the useful imprecision of concept in all its uses. What concepts are there? No doubt there is a concept associated with any ordinary classificatory adjective or general noun, but is there also a concept of negation associated with not and its cognates, or of totally associated with all and its cognates? Kant answers these questions affirmatively. He uses the concept terminology to codify those features of judgments which concern the sort of work they do, and he pays attention to the great variety of features of this kind which a judgment may have. The judgment that this is a man singles out something as human and therefore employs the concept of humanity, but it is a further fact about it that it affirms rather than denies. The judgment that all men are mortal is about humans and is affirmative, and has the further feature that it says that all rather than some or rather than some or one of certain class have a certain property. Kant therefore includes in his inventory of concepts not only concepts like that of humanity and neurosis, but also the concept of negation and totality, singularity and conditionality, and so on. He insists that there are important differences between these concepts and more run of the mill ones. He does not regard negation and its like as optional intellectual equipment in the way in which the concept of neurosis is. And he will agree that where someone who lacks the concept of neurosis can be given it by being taught how to use neurotic and its cognates, there is, as I shall argue in 27, no technique for teaching the meaning or of not to someone who lacks the concept of negation, but this is perfectly consistent with his wanting to use concept in connection with these extremely general features of judgments. Even if one cannot lack the concept of negation without lacking every concept, it remains true that a person's being able to cope with negative judgments is a fact, albeit an unsurprising one, about what he can do. Facts involving such general, basic, formal features of judgments as negativeness ought not to go without saying. In realist categories on which these sections has leaned heavily, the point is put thus. In Aristotle's doctrine of the categories, the roles of form words like all, some, the, a, any, if, and not are unassociated, and medieval followers relegated these words to limbo under the grudging appellation of syncategorimatic. Kant's doctrine restores them from the limbo of logic into its workshop. 22. The table of judgments. I have described the concepts of negation, totally, etc. as general, basic and formal, but I claim no precision for these labels. It remains to be seen whether any sharp line can be drawn between those concepts, which we should be inclined to group with those of totally and negation, and the concepts which we should group with those of humanity and neurosis. The concept of totality is obviously more basic and general than that of humanity, but Kant believes that the difference is not just one of degree. Like some philosophers today, he thinks that concepts like those of negation and totality are formal, while descriptive of or classificatory concepts are material. On this view, he spoke about humans, characterizes the matter of his judgment, while he said something universal, characterizes its form. Kant thinks that this formal material distinction is precise and absolute. He further believes that there are 12 formal concepts out of which all other formal concepts can be defined. Finally, he thinks that these 12, just because they are the primitive formal concepts, have a complex group of privileges which entitles them to be called a priori concepts or categories. I shall normally use the phrase the categories as a neutral label for this set of 12 concepts, not thereby conceding them any special Kantian categorical status. Context will show when category is being used, not in this way, but rather with the philosophical load which Kant puts upon it. When Kant calls his 12 concepts categories, part of what he means is that to use any concepts at all, one must use the 12 on his list. Since to use a concept is to make a judgment of a certain kind, it follows, as subject to a qualification to be discussed in 24, that there are 12 concepts which must be used, if any are used, is equivalent to there are 12 kinds of judgments which must be made if any are made. Kant exploits this equivalence by deriving his list of supposedly indispensable concepts from a list of supposedly indispensable kinds of judgment. The latter is introduced as a list of formal features of judgments. If we abstract from all content of a judgment and consider only the mere form of understanding, we find that the function of thought is in judgment can be brought under 4 heads, each of which contains 3 elements. They may be conveniently represented in the following table. 1. Quantity, singular, particular, universal. 2. Quality, affirmative, negative, infinitive. 3. Relation, categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive. 4. Modality, problematic, assertoric, apodeictic. Some explanations are called for. 1. The 3 quantity features are those possessed by the judgments that my dog is stupid, that some dogs are stupid, and that all dogs are stupid. In Kant's list, the order of these 3 features is reversed, but this is a slip. The associated trio of concepts is given as unity, plurality, and totality. And one remark of Kant's depends upon their being taken in that order. The trio of judgment features should therefore be given as above in the corresponding order. 2. An infinite judgment is one which is negative in force but affirmative in form. The general idea is as follows. In the affirmative judgment that Henry is mortal, a thing is assigned to be restricted class of moral beings, whereas in the negative judgment that Henry is not mortal, the thing is not assigned to any class but is merely excluded from one and so left, as it were, wandering in the infinitive range of alternative possibilities. The judgment that Henry is non-mortal is affirmative in form, but unlike genuinely affirmative judgments, it merely excludes something from a certain class, and this is why Kant calls it infinite. The judgment in question, by the way, is one which might be true because Henry is a mountain, and mountains cannot die. It should not be confused with the judgment that Henry is immortal, where immortal means alive but not going to die. This really won't do. The case for denying that Henry is not mortal is affirmative in a case for saying that it is negative. It is uncharacteristic of Kant to say that the two sentences Henry is non-mortal and Henry is not mortal, which do the same work in almost the same way, nevertheless express different kinds of judgment, just because they differ in a minor verbal detail. I fear that part of the reason for this mistake is that Kant wants four times three indispensable kinds of judgments and needs infinitive judgments to make up the complement. 3. A hypothetical judgment is one which can be expressed in a sentence of the form if then. A disjunctive judgment can take to be one expressible in the form either or but not both. A categorical judgment is one which is neither hypothetical nor disjunctive. 4. Kant's explanation of the modality features is obscure, but what he ought to say is that a judgment is problematic if it says of something that it may be the case, assertoric if it says of something that it is the case, and apodeictic if it says of something that it must be the case. The problematic must be distinguished from the possible, and the apodeictic from the necessary. The concepts associated with the modal features are supposed to be pretty much our ordinary concepts of possibility and necessity. These are involved in all judgments about the possibility or necessity of other judgments, but not in all judgments which are themselves possible or necessary, any more than the concept of complexity is involved in all complex judgments. For example, the concept of possibility is involved in the problematic judgment that it is possible that the grass is blue, but not in the possible judgment that grass is blue. Similarly, the concept of necessity is involved in the apodeictic judgment that it is necessary that 2 plus 2 is 4, but not in the necessary judgment that 2 plus 2 is 4. In fact, there is no one concept associated with all possible judgments or with all necessary judgments. And my explanation of concepts in the preceding section shows why. Possible judgments do not form a functional kind. There is no kind of task which it is their duty to perform, in the way in which problematic judgments do perform the task of asserting that something is possible. Similarly, necessary judgments do not constitute a functional kind as apodeictic judgments do. My association of functional kinds with word occurrence also fits into place here. Problematic judgments could all be expressed in sentences which do the same sort of work as English sentences containing possible, but nothing analogous to this could be said of possible judgments. Kant gives something like the above account of the modality features, but confuses the situation by saying that the antecedent of a hypothetical judgment is always problematic because it is not positively asserted as true, and by making some equally odd remarks about the part of syllogisms. I think we can see that what leads him into this mistake. The judgment that if Lee it is command, then Richmond will not be taken. Like the judgment that if it's possible that Lee is in command makes use of but does not positively assert the judgment that Lee is in command. We might even say that each expresses a sort of hesitancy or reserve with respect to this judgment. It is this vague similarity which leads Kant to say that the judgment that Lee is in command occurs problematically in both cases, but this is too vague to be taken seriously. And anyway, it nullifies everything Kant says about the associated concept of possibility. 23. The metaphysical deduction of the categories. In assessing Kant's attempt to infer the indispensability of his dozen judgment features from their formality, and it is natural to start by asking just what formal means. Some writers of logic textbooks still adopt the bad old assumption that between the formal and the material features of a judgment there is a distinction which, although curiously resistant to definition or clear explanation, is nevertheless absolute and important. This tradition, to which Kant's use of formal also belongs as being cogently attacked, and I shall not rehearse the objections to it here. One comment, however, may be worth making. Going by the examples of formality which are usually given, it seems that the words in a sentence which are relevant to the form of the judgment it expresses include entails, but not is evidence for, possible, but not probable. It is necessary that, but not it is known that. Is identical with, but not is similar to. All, but not most. These examples powerfully suggest that the form-content distinction is not absolute, but relative. Specifically, that that it is relative to the judgment features which have been intensively studied in what are called formal systematic of logic. Perhaps with the growth of the systematic logical study of confirmation, probably the so-called epistemic modalities, the first three items on the right hand list will become to be relevant to adjustments from rather than to its content. Anyway, there seems to be no sense of formal in which we are entitled to say that the items in the left-hand columns just do, while those in the right-hand column just don't pertain to formality. Yet Kant, like many others, clearly assumes that his formal material distinction is timelessly valid for judgments expressed in any language at all. The falsity of that assumption bodes ill for the success of the metaphysical deduction of the categories, since this is supposed to involve formality and to yield a conclusion which is valid for all humans at all times. But the metaphysical deduction fails in another way as well, waiving the doubt as to whether Kant can give to formal a suitably absolute sense. We can get a general picture of how he thinks a premise about formality might support a conclusion about indispensability. And this picture, sketchy as it is, will tell us enough about Kant's argument for us to realize that the argument is certainly invalid. Kant says that his dozen judgment features specify the understanding completely and yield an exhaustive inventory of its powers. There are, of course, countless intellectual operations like thinking about humans and distinguishing hawks from handsaws, which are not on Kant's list. But he claims only that his list gives a complete formal account of what the understanding can do. Consider a machine which can be adapted to drill holes, trim edges, polish floors, and so on. An exhaustive inventory of the machine's powers will have to include millions of items like trimming a private edge into the shape of a gondola, sanding the floor of a stockbroker's office, and so on. But one kind of account of its powers may be given exhaustively yet briefly, namely a technical account of the movements of which it is capable and of the ways in which it can be prepared for the attachment of accessories. Thus, the driving shaft can rotate at either 1800, 2400 or 3000 RPM. At any speed, it can rotate in either direction. Whatever the speed and direction, there is an eccentric gear which may be engaged or disengaged. A pair of attachment flanges may have to one another an angle of either 90 degrees or 45 degrees or 0 degrees. A description of the machine's activities which is couched in these terms and which omits to say what is attached to the machine or what job it is being used for might be called a formal description. In some such fashion as this, though we must not press for details, Kant thinks of his list of judgment features as embodying a technical account of all the basic kinds of operation of which the understanding is capable, and as in that sense specifying the form of the understanding. The machine analogy illustrates also the argument from formality to indispensability. If it has just 3 speeds, 2 directions, etc., then the machine can work at all. Whether sawing wood or whipping cream, only if it goes at one of those speeds, in one of those directions, etc. Similarly, the understanding can work at all only if it operates in some way mentioned on Kant's list. No one can make judgments without making judgments of at least some of the listed kinds. This analogy does in fact fail because of a point which Kant seems to overlook. Every use of the machine involves one speed, one direction, etc. But it is not true that every judgment that one feature from each trio. Every categorical judgment does itself have a quantity feature, but of a hypothetical of disjunctive judgment we can say only that its constituent judgments have quantity features. For example, the judgment that if all men are married, then some women are single is not itself either universal or particular or singular, though its antecedent is universal and its consequent particular. A similar point applies to problematic and apodeictic judgments. Nothing of importance for Kant's program hangs on this, however, and I shall therefore pretend that it is plausible to say of each judgment that it has one feature from each trio. Without knowing precisely that what Kant means by his claim to have inventoried the formal powers of the understanding, we can show that his argument, just because it is an argument from an inventory, shows only that all judgment making must involve judgments with at least one feature from each trio, and the restriction to this limited conclusion leads in turn to the collapse of the entire argument. The restriction is forced upon Kant in the following way: the conclusion that if the machine is ever used, it must be used at one of the three stated speeds rests upon the fact that every use of the machine involves one of those speeds. To show the indispensability of each speed, we should have to stop talking about the conditions which every use of the machine must satisfy, and find some justification for saying that if the machine is ever used, it must at different times be used at each of these three possible speeds. Such a justification could obviously not be provided by a mere inventory of the machine's possible speeds. Similarly, since it is absurd to say that every judgment has each feature from each trio, a claim that all 12 kinds of judgment are indispensable must take some such form, as any extended judgment-making performance must somewhere along its length involve judgments of each of the 12 kinds, or perhaps any judgment-making creature must from must from time to time make judgments of each of the 12 kinds. Again, nothing of this kind can be supported by an inventory of kinds of judgment, no matter what status is claimed for the inventory's contents. A modest conclusion may be better than none. Perhaps Kant has shown at least something about the indispensability of kinds of judgment, but has he? If he retains the argument from an inventory, his conclusion may become not just modest but trivial. It is trivial in respect of a given tree of judgment features if one of them is so defined that for a judgment to have, it is simply for it to lack the other two. For example, if assertoric means merely neither problematic nor apodeictic, then it follows that to judge at all, one must take assertoric or problematic or apodeictic judgments. Is as boring as assertion as to judge at all. One must make judgments which are about walnut trees, or about bobsleds, or about neither. If the metaphysical deduction is not thus to slither into triviality, the judgment features must be so defined that it is not true by definition that every judgment has some feature from each trio. For example, an assertoric judgment must be defined as one which is neither problematic nor apodeictic, but something else instead. Kant presents his list so casually that one cannot tell whether he thinks he can construe each trio in this way. But this uncertainty does not matter, for if the trios are so construed, a further difficulty arises. Consider what is involved in saying that every judgment must have a feature from each trio, while denying that this is true by definition. The machine analog of this is all right. That the machine should run at an unlisted speed is ruled out not by definition but on technical grounds. It is impossible because of the way the machine is built. Kant sometimes thinks of his indispensability claim similarly as following from a structural description of the understanding, and thus takes every judgment must have some feature from each trio, not as an application of the law of excluded middle, but as a consequence of some facts about what the understanding, the judging faculty, is like. This approach is suggested by the phrase exhaustive inventory. One expects an inventory to be descriptive of that of which it is an inventory. But what sort of facts are facts about what the understanding is like? If they are a posteriori, like the analogous facts about the machine, then the official program of the critic collapses in ruins, and Kant knows this perfectly well. If on the other hand, what Kant is saying about the understanding is offered as synthetic and a priori, then he is surrounded by the swarm of difficulties which bested the outer sense theory when this was construed as an account of the mode of operation of a nominal outer sense. Kant notes this parallel when he speaks of something as being as little capable of further explanation as why we have just this and no other functions of judgment, or why space and time are the only forms of our possible intuition. That he can take this so calmly does not mean that we shouldn't do likewise. There remains the possibility that what Kant says about the understanding might be analytic but not true by definition. I think that along these lines something might be saved, analogous to the partial salvage of the outer sense theory. Such a salvage will involve finding analytic but untrivial truths of the form any extended judgment-making performance must include the making of judgments of such and such kinds, or any concept using creature must possess such and such concepts, and it will not reify or nominalize the understanding, nor will it rest on the table of judgments. I shall try to show of certain specific kinds of judgment that they are indispensable in a certain way, but I shall not try to rescue from triviality the weak thesis that every judgment must have one feature from each trio. This thesis is a bore, whatever its status, and in any case I do not see how it can be analytic except by being true by definition. The classificatory words in the table seem to offer no prospect of complex analysis such as might be possible in respect of concept employing performance, or use of the understanding or the like. It may have been unfair to take the inventory metaphor literally, to press the machine analogy so hard, and to take at face value Kant's claim that these results are synthetic and a priori. But the real troubles of the metaphysical deduction lie deeper than that. They arise from one skeletal fact about Kant's argument, namely that he tries to derive claims about indispensability from the table of judgments. If this tedious section has lifted from our shoulders the dead weight of the argument from the table of judgments, it has been worth the labor. We shall still have to attend to Kant's list of judgment features, but not as a list which, like the social register, purports by its mere existence to prove something about the status of its contents. Seven. The categories considered. 24. Concepts and language. In essaying an analytic salvage of something from the metaphysical deduction, our first bother is that we do not know what to analyze. I have adopted Kant's equation of X has concepts, with X can make judgments, and his assumption that if X makes a judgment, then X could express it in a language. These are both wrong. To make a judgment in Kant's sense is to think or believe that something is the case, and in this sense judgments are often made by creatures which have no language. We say, not as a joke or a metaphor, that the scampering dog thinks that its master is holding a bone, and Kant gives no reason for eschewing this kind of talk. On the other hand, there is little work for concept to do outside the realm of language. To credit a rat with a concept of triangularity because it reacts selectively to triangles is to take a word which serves well as an impressive technical tool in certain linguistic contexts, and to press it into a different service whose connection with its normal work is at best obscure. The formula, a concept is recognitional capacity, though wide enough to cover the uses of concept both in animal psychology and in philosophy, omits most of what is important in the philosopher's use of the word. Until we have a clear view of how linguistic behavior relates to selectivity, to selective response, to kinds of stimulus, we ought to restrict the word concept to the task which we know it will perform. This is not a claim about what rats cannot do, but merely a counsel of caution about the use of the word concept. I therefore agree with Kant that creatures which lack a language lack concepts, though not for what seems to be his reason, namely that creatures which lack a language cannot make judgments. I wish to go further in this direction and say that a creature cannot have concept unless its language is of a certain special sort. If someone's linguistic behavior consisted solely in applying words to presented bits of the world, so that he never made general statements and thus never gave reasons for what he said, what questions could we usefully raise about his concepts? We can find employment for the phrase concept of humanity, only because people can say as well as things like this is not human and that is a man. Also things like humans sometimes laugh, and there is a world of difference between humans and apes, and a human could not be made in a laboratory by a human. A language containing nothing of these kinds will be merely a pattern of linguistic responses to sensory stimuli, and will not more put concept to work than do the selective non-linguistic responses of rats. I shall use the phrase concept exercising language as an abbreviation for language of the highly developed kind, in connection with which concept can be given real work to do. An example whose meta-language can usefully contain the word concept. To abbreviate it is not, of course, to clarify. I should remark in passing that I am deliberately giving short shrift to the view that concepts are independent entities whose association with words give the latter their meaning, and which are to be analyzed by means of a kind of intuition. The picture of the philosophical analyst as using his dictionary to locate his subject matter and then his intuition to examine it grotesquely misrepresents what happens when philosophers analyze concepts. The suggestion that it must be correct because facts about word meanings are contingent while philosophical results are necessary is just naive. Nor is this view of conceptual analysis supported by the facts, such stressed by Moore, that we sometimes want to say something but cannot find the words for it. In such a case, it is said we are in the presence of a concept complex called a proposition, whose non-linguistic nature is shown by the fact that we have no words attached to it. What has not been shown is what his finger-snapping kind of situation has to do with serious philosophical investigations. The Moorean methodology, in which all questions about the meanings of words are regarded as mere lexicographical preliminaries to the serious business of applying intuitions to concepts, is in fact impossible. Once we have agreed on all the questions about word uses, we have agreed on all the questions there are about the analysis of concepts. If we try to isolate a disagreement about the nature of a given concept, one or two things happens. A. The disagreement turns out to concern the uses of words. In example, to concern according to Moore's story, what concept is associated with a given expression rather than what the nature is of a given concept. B. The disagreement turns out to be utterly vacuous. Thus Moore starts with his official position. I shall therefore use the word good in the sense in which I think it is ordinarily used, but at the same time I am not anxious to discuss whether I am right in thinking that it is so used. My business is solely with that object or idea, which I hold, rightly or wrongly, that the word is generally used to stand for. What I want to discover is the nature of that object or idea. And about this I am extremely anxious to arrive at an agreement. He then makes his central claim that the object or idea in question is simple, or, as he sometimes says, that it cannot be defined, and proceeds to draw from this a conclusion which he must call lexicographical. If I am asked how is good to be defined, my answer is that it cannot be defined, and that is all I have to say about it. If I am right, then nobody can foist upon us such an axiom that pleasure is the only good, or that the good is the desired, on the presence that this is the very meaning of the word. Let us try to rescue more from the lexicography which dogs him by challenging his God is simple thesis in a way which does not generate any definitions of the word God. We might do this by claiming that good is not simple but complex, because it has three constituent concepts for which there are no standard names. This presumably is a disagreement purely about the nature of a concept. Our dictionaries and our attention to how words are used are put behind us, and it is now up to our intuitions to settle the issue. But of course there is no disagreement here. We are just words pining. The alternative to lexicography is vacuity. I return now to the main thread of my argument. It seems that we may seek analytic conclusions of any one of three kinds. 1. Any creature which makes judgments at all makes judgments of such and such and as a kind. 2. Any language has means for expressing judgments of such and such a kind. And 3. Any concept exercising language has means for expressing judgments of such and such a kind. Can conflate these three, but their distinctness must be enforced. I doubt that anything interesting of kind 2 can be proved. Attempts to prove that this or that sort of statement must be expressible in any language have always met with failure. Admittedly, the concept of language has so far been treated but glibly and superficially, but I conjecture that a mature and suitably complex analysis of this concept, so far from yielding valuable results of kind 2, will merely reveal that none can be had. It seems to follow that there is nothing analytic to be said of kind 1 either. Statements of kind 3 present a different case. The question of whether a language is a concept exercising one does depend upon what sorts of statements can be made in it. For example, it depends partly upon whether statements of a general or reason-giving kind can be made in it. But if we seek an impressive list of results of kind 3, we are hampered by the vagueness of the phrase concept exercising language, in terms of which kind 3 is defined. Furthermore, even if we could give precision to this phrase, there is an inhibiting worry. Why should we care about what a language has to be like for this word concept to be useful in describing it? Why should this one word be allowed to define a whole analytic inquiry? The two difficulties can be taken together. Clarifying and justifying here go hand in hand. The class of possible languages divides into those whose use does and those whose use does not consist solely in pattern of responses to sensory stimuli. I discuss this distinction at length in my book Rationality, and here sketch it only in outline. A language consists solely of statements of the form "this is" and "that is." Can be seen as a technique for the linguistic handling of items which are presented to the speaker. It has been called the speaker's way of hitting back, and the things which sensorily bombard him. But human languages have means for making at least two sorts of statements which are not like this: general statements and statements about the past. These do not have to be responses to or operations upon the environments in which they are made. Furthermore, they express judgments which cannot be expressed except in a language. There is a natural, though weak sense of express, in which it is true that many kinds of judgment can be expressed not only by non-linguistic behavior, but general and past tense judgments are not among them. It might be thought that a dog which retrieves a bone thereby expresses the judgment. An example shows that it thinks that the bone has buried here last week, but the dog's digging expresses this judgment about the past only if it also expresses the general judgment that buried bones stay put. Without a language, there is no way of expressing judgments about the past without thereby expressing general judgments, or of expressing general judgments without thereby expressing judgments about the past. Are we to say then that the dog makes two distinct judgments which it unhappily cannot express in its isolation from one another? Would it not make better sense to say that the dog makes and expresses the single judgment that the bone is there, and add that its past experience has caused it to make this judgment? On the other hand, if the dog had a language in which to say that the bone was buried there last week, then we should certainly agree that it was making and expressing a judgment about the past, and that this was its reason for making a certain judgment about the present. These uses of language, which are not mere linguistic responses to stimuli, and which express judgments that cannot be expressed except in languages, overlap or coincide with the uses which are most relevant to whether a given language counts as a concept exercising one. I think that Kant's primary interest is in judgments about general and past states of affairs, and that this is why he considers only judgments expressible in a language and restricts himself further to languages of the developed kind, which I call concept exercising. Kant apparently believes that unless a creature can make judgments about past and general states of affairs, it cannot really make judgments at all. He will probably say that the dog does not think that the bone is there unless it has reasons for thinking this, and thus makes judgments about past and general states of affairs. I find this illiberal, but I do agree with Kant that a great deal turns on the difference between those who can make past and general judgments and those who cannot. I have argued in rationality that this difference, more than any other, justifies the common conviction that there is an important difference of kind between human and non-human intellectual capacities. And in 30 and 31, we shall see that it connects with the notion of self-consciousness in such a way as entirely to justify Kant's exclusive attention to the kind of intellectual capacity which includes an ability to make judgments about the past and general judgments. I shall take it that a concept exercising language is pretty much the same as a language in which past tense and general statements can be made. It does not matter whether this equivalence is exact or not. Throughout the Critic, when Kant speaks of judgments, of concepts, and of understanding, he is unquestionably referring to the area of intellectual competence, which is roughly marked off by the phrase concept exercising language. This is what justifies a scrutiny of the notion of a concept exercising language in a work of Kantian eugenesis. 25. Some indispensable concepts. What reasons are there for saying that Kant's 12 categories must be used in any concept exercising language? A perfunctory answer will have to do, as an exhaustive one will take half a book. It is not essential for the assessment of the critic as a whole that we should decide just what concepts are indispensable or categorical, for Kant's favorite doesn't serve throughout the rest of the critic only as a Procrustean bed on which he hacks and wrenches his philosophical insights into a grotesque system, and the ground floor level where he drops the running commentary and gets to work. The precise contents on the list of categories are singularly unimportant. The argument of 26 will tend to support this twofold thesis that the list's systematic or architectonic use is negligible, and that it has no other uses in the critic. Quality, the concept of limitation, which corresponds to the spurious class of infinite judgments, is a non-starter, but it is likely that the other two categories of quality, viz., reality and negation, will have to occur in any concept employing language. It seems obvious that any language must contain affirmative statements and must therefore employ Kant's concept of reality, if it employs concepts at all. It is arguable that any concept exercising language must also contain negative statements, perhaps not precise analogues of the form "it is not the case that," but statements which reject or rule out other statements. I have argued for this in rationality on the grounds roughly that a concept exercising language must contain something like because, which in its turn requires something like that doesn't follow. At a non-technical level, it is perhaps worth nothing that any pattern of behavior looks blind and mechanical unless it contains something of a mistake recognizing and mistake correcting kinds. This was one reason why Spinoza's God, which neither commits nor encounters errors, often strikes readers of Spinoza as merely mindless. Quantity. A concept exercising language is one in which reasons can be given and general statements made, and thus it must employ the concept of totality. This, together with negation, yields the concept of plurality. Kant errs in saying that no item in his dozen can be defined out of the others. The concept of unity, which is the ability to cope with singular judgments, raises and leaves a life problem. In these methods of logic, Quine says that all the work done by statements of the form F is G will be done by the form. It is not the case that there are no F's. It is not the case that there are at least two F's, and there are no F's which are not G, and that we could therefore dispense with the former in favor of the latter. Since the latter contains no individual referring expressions such as names or definite descriptions, it seems to follow that a concept exercising language could lack all such expressions and thus could lack the concept of unity. In his article, Singular Terms, Strawson argues that although individual referring expressions can be paraphrased out of a language which is a going concern, no language could lack such expressions ab initio. He argues from the empiricism premise that for any universal terms to be understood, some universal terms must be learned ostensibly by direct confrontation. This implies that to understand a language, one must learn some meanings ostensibly. And this, Strawson claims, requires that one understands such statements as that this is hot, and that is hot, and this other is not hot. Those individual referring expressions are essential to the procedures which launch one's understanding of a language. And so, although such expressions are eliminable, they are not dispensable. Ostensive samples can be indicated digitally as well as verbally, but this does not rebut Strawson's argument for pointing is a linguistic activity. It is a rule-governed procedure for calling attention to particulars and is intimately connected with the rest of our language. Its non-verbal nature is as nothing compared with the features of it which entitle it to be deemed linguistic. Against Strawson's view, however, I suggest that one can present a child with ostensive samples without referring to them at all. If referring to a thing is directing someone's attention to it in a rule-governed way, one may utter a word when the child just happens to be attending to the object to which the word applies, or one may cause the child to attend to the object by waving it in front of the child's face. These means are not merely permissible, they are practically unavoidable. As a matter of fact, when one tries to point something out to a very young child, the child looks at one's hands. It learns the significance of pointing, as of words like this, after and through its grasp of other words. One points to the door and says, "Door," and the child starts to understand pointing if it already understands door. And this requires its having had its attention called to doors by means which could not possibly be accounted linguistic. Ostension, then, does not require reference. It may be that ostensive teaching requires reference, and that if one says door while the child happens to be attending to a door, one is not teaching the child but only conditioning it. I think there is virtue in so using teach and learn, that ostensive teaching or learning does require reference, but this concedes nothing to Strasson's view. On the contrary, it is a reason for rejecting his empiricist premise that for any general words to be understood, some of them must have been learned ostensively. If learn means more than acquire, then the premise seems false. If it means the same as acquire, then the premise does not yield the required conclusion. Strasson seems to take a reformulation of his empiricist premise, something which could be significantly different from it. Some universal terms must be connected with our experience if any are to be understood, and these universal terms must be connected with particular bits or slices of our experience. If connected with here means derived from, we are back where we started, but if it means answerable to, then this new premise may support something like Strasson's conclusion. For now it points to issues about use rather than about acquisition. It led us out to this nursery into the world of fully fledged concept exercising linguistic behavior, and here we have perhaps some hope of arguments for the indispensability of individual referring expressions. The only arguments I can find for such a conclusion, however, are complex and inconclusive. In any case, there is something odd about this debate. Suppose it were shown to be necessary that a concept exercising language should have ways of referring to individuals and saying something about them. Why should we not say that the Quinian form is not the case, that there are no Fs, etc. is such a way? Its parts have other uses as well, but that does not imply that when they are put together like this, they do not really express a singular judgment. We might indeed deny that the concept of unity was at work in a language in which the Quinian paraphrase has developed as an optional afterthought to the quintificational uses of its constituent parts, and in which there were no other means for referring to individuals. But it is not clear to me that Quine wants to say that there could be such a language. If he does, then I am inclined to agree with Strasson's conclusion that he is mistaken. Modality. A concept exercising language need not employ the concept of necessity and possibility. It is sometimes thought that to know what an expression means involves knowing which sentences containing it are analytic and which self-contradictory. If this were correct, then one could understand a language only if one had the concept of analyticity and contradictoriness, and thus perhaps the concept of necessity and possibility. But it is not correct. If it were true, I have argued in 21 that it is not, that synthetic sentences are directly relevant to truth but not to meanings. Then it might follow that the users of any language must have the concept of necessity if they are to be able to distinguishing misinformation from misunderstanding. But I can think of no other grounds for saying that model concepts must have a place in any concept exercising language. Since we can thus dismiss the model concepts, we can snub the so-called concept of existence, which is the capacity to handle assertoric or non-model judgments. Just because the model concepts are so thoroughly dispensable, it is boring to be told that a language must contain sentences which do not involve them, in the same way as it would be boring to be told that a language must contain statements which do not involve the concept of a walnut tree. I have offered the sultry arguments for the indispensability to any concept exercising language of 4 of Kant's dozen. I have edged about the concept of unity, and I have dismissed limitation and as incoherent, necessity and possibility as dispensable, and existence as boringly indispensable. There remain the 3 rational categories, which need a section to themselves. 26. The relational categories. These are supposed to correspond to the judgment features categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. And Kant's names for them are inherence and subsistence, causality and dependence, and community, subject to a qualification which I shall mention in 37. He takes this to be the concepts of substance, cause, and mutual interaction, respectively, whence it follows that they do not relate to their associated judgment features as officially they should. Whether we take substance in Kant's very strong sense of sempiternal thing, or as fairly durable thing, or in some yet weaker sense, it is just not true that the only task of categorical judgment is to attribute properties to substances. Again, causal judgments are only a subclass of hypotheticals, and the concept of cause is therefore not just the ability to handle hypotheticals. For one thing, causal judgments are as closely allied to universal as to hypothetical judgments, yet Kant does not equate the concept of cause with that of totality. I say nothing of disjunctiveness in relation to community, for the concept of community is simple, constructible out of that of causality, and therefore does not need separate treatment. Kant thinks it's rather obvious that any concept exercising language must use the other 9 categories, and this is natural in one who complacently assumes that there is something ineluctably right about the structure of the Indo-European languages, and does not consider that what was sort of rightness it will be relevant, let alone true, to attribute to them. But no such assumption could generate the belief that any concept exercising language must use the concept of substance, cause, and community, even if the table of judgments were relevant, as it is not, to categorical status of some of Kant's dozen. These three will still be left out in the cold because they do not relate as they are supposed to with their associated judgment features. It is therefore not surprising that later in the Critic, Kant argues for the indispensability of the concept of substance, cause, and community with a seriousness which he at no time devotes to the other concept on his list. He does this in a chapter called System of All Participles of Pure Understanding, whose relationship with the metaphysical deduction has confronted commentators with a puzzle for which I now offer a solution. The principles chapter is often seen as an attempt to prove that each of the categories is a priori applicable to experience. Yet Kant is committed to thinking that he has proved this before he gets as far as the principles chapter. The transcendental deduction will argue that we cannot have experience which is not brought under some concept. The metaphysical deduction argues that to use any concept is to use Kant's dozen. In particular, whence it should follow that there cannot be experience in connection with which Kant's dozen cannot be used. On Kant's own showing, then, what is there left for the principles chapter to prove? A popular answer is that the metaphysical deduction is not meant to show that all the categories are indispensable, but only that no other concepts are indispensable. Kant boasts that the table of judgments guarantees that he has not overlooked any a priori concepts, suggests that the burden of the metaphysical deduction is just any a priori concepts there may be are on the list. This is compatible with some concepts on the list are not a priori, and so leaves work for the principles chapter to do. I shall call this the short list interpretation. It says that Kant intends the metaphysical deduction only to draw up a short list of all the possible candidates for a priority, leaving the principles chapter to decide which of the 12 candidacies is successful. The short list interpretation is wrong. Kant says that his list is not that it contains an enumeration of all the a priori concepts. The very passage in which the list's completeness is stressed bears this out, as does an earlier one in which, after giving an obscure preview of the transcendental deduction, Kant says that from this together with the table of judgments, quote, there arise precisely the same number of pure concepts of the understanding which apply a priori to objects of intuition in general. As in the preceding table, there have been found to be logical functions in all possible judgments, for these functions specify the understanding completely and yield an exhaustive inventory of its powers. These concepts we shall, with Aristotle, call categories. This plainly says that all the listed concepts are indispensable. Not just that any indispensable concept, there are there may be are on the list. In any case, the short list interpretation is absurd in itself. We can understand if we do not accept Kant's belief that the indispensability of the listed concepts follows from their vague privilege as basic and formal. But how could he think that the status of the concepts which are on the list could imply the dispensability of concepts which are not on it? Only by equating indispensable concepts with concepts which define the formal powers of the understanding. But this implies the dispensability of all unlisted concepts only by claiming the indispensability of all the listed ones. And the whole point of the short list interpretation is to deny that Kant makes the latter claim in the metaphysical deduction. Since Kant's words and its own inherent inadequacy are against the short list account, we still have a problem about what Kant is up to the principal chapter. The fact is that in that chapter, Kant does not try to prove the priority of each of his 12 concepts. His declared intention is to state and prove all the synthetic and a priori truths which stem from the categorical status of the 12. It will be natural to expect that Kant will be at least offer a principle for each category, saying that it must apply to all experience, but for 9 of them he offers nothing of the sort. He evades the categories of quantity by palming off on us an entirely different concept which the label quantity also fits. He ignores the concept of limitation and discusses the concept of reality and negation without even trying to show their a priori applicability to all experience. And for the model categories, he produces no principles at all, but only explanation of the model categories in their empirical employment, giving a specious reason why this all he can do. For the relational categories alone, thus can seriously undertake a proof of a priority. This identically is a further objection to the short list story. The latter purpose to show why there should be 12 separate indispensability arguments in the principles chapter. Now it turns out that there are only 3. Since the principles associated with the relational categories are just the statements that the latter are categories, in example, are applicable to a priori to all experience, it is suspicious that Kant does not offer to prove analogous principles from the other 9. On the other hand, since the categorical status of all 12 concepts is supposed to be established in the deductions, why does Kant later repeat the job for even 3 of them? To sort all of this out to be convict Kant of error. But we can now see that he has made one understandable mistake. Now not two bewildering ones. The point is that the 3 categories whose a priority is determinedly argued for in the principles chapter are the 3 which most need such argument. Their indispensability has not the fineness appearance of following from the table of judgments, because they simply do not correspond to the table of judgments as Kant says they do. I do not congratulate Kant for thinking that the metaphysical deduction does a job which utterly fails to do. But given that mistake, it was reasonable for him to try to complete the job when an opportunity presented itself later in the critique. If it were just a coincidence that the principal chapter argues for the categorical status of all and only those concepts which do not relate properly to the table of judgments, it will be a remarkable coincidence indeed. It is more reasonable to say that Kant was at some level aware of what his total failures were in the metaphysical deduction. He was too good a philosopher not to be. But he was so much a victim of his own passion for system that he ignored the breakdown in the parallel between the table of categories and the table of judgments, and pushed doggedly on, claiming complete success for the metaphysical deduction and dealing evasively with the question of what is supposed to be happening in the principles chapter. Another aspect of this matter will be discussed in the end of 31. The acquisition of 27. The acquisition of concepts. I have spoken of discoveries which might be made about what a creature must be able to do in order to count as having concepts, or about what a pattern of behavior must be like to account as the use of a concept exercised in language, but I have said nothing about how concept must be acquired. My concern has been with the analysis of concepts, not with the genesis of concepts. This reflects Kant's own insistence that his concern is with the use of concepts and not with their de facto mode of origination. He sometimes speaks of the a priori origin of source of the categories, but these passages use origin, etc. Oddly, they express no interest whatsoever in traditional questions about how concepts are acquired. Philosophers have frequently discussed questions about concept acquisition which they were not equipped to answer. Early in both treatise and inquiry, Hume says that to have a concept, one must first be confronted with instances of it or simpler concept out of which it can be construed. He presents this as an empirical hypothesis, which could be killed by a counter instance. Those who will assert that this position is not universally true have only one method of refuting it, by producing that idea which, in their opinion, is not derived from this source. It will then be incumbent on us, if we will maintain our doctrine, to produce the impression or lively perception which corresponds to it. Later, however, Hume uses this doctrine in a priori way, saying that those who think they have a concept of necessary connection must be wrong about this, because there can be no confrontation with an instance or of casual necessity. Clearly something has gone wrong. When the detail is filled in, it can be seen that many things are very wrong. This doctrine of Hume's is, of all the reality fruitful contributions ever made to philosophy, the most rightly with error. The one correct feature of Hume's handling of his doctrine is the one which he drops almost immediately, namely his treatment of it as empirically falsifiable. Just because it says that before having a concept, one must have certain experiences, the doctrine is vulnerable to the possibility that someone should have the concept without having fulfilled the doctrinal prerequisites. Hume itself taught us that there are no irrefutable statements connecting what is the case at a given time with what was the case earlier. I do not conclude that Hume should have allowed himself to be refuted by John Dew's. John Dew's claims to have a concept of necessary connection. Hume's word for concept is idea, and for him ideas are faded sensory states. And he therefore cannot say that it will be to produce a counterexample to his doctrine. What he needs here is the Kantian theory of concepts as intellectual skills, the proof of whose possessions lies in their exercise. This is why prerequisites for the possession of concepts where prey has a temporal force are not the philosopher's business. I don't know whether I can play the piano. I have never tried. This is over-optimistic, but it is logically possible that someone should play the piano well at his first attempt. Or again, I do not believe that a man born blind could apply color words surely and correctly from the first moment of gaining his sight. But this belief, strong as it is, gets no support from any philosophical considerations. Within the genus concept acquisition, there is the species concept learning, and with these philosophers may have a legitimate concern. Learning how to do something is not the only way of coming to be able to do it. Wittgenstein points out that if someone underwent a brain operation which made him able to speak Latin perfectly, we should not say that he had learned Latin on the operating table. Perhaps then we can establish some necessary truths about what a person must undergo before he can count as having learned a concept. Nothing is logically prerequisite to a concept having been acquired except its being not processed and then later possessed. But there are logical prerequisites to a concept having been learned, namely those which mark off learning from other sources of acquisition. Learning, I suggest, involves the active rational cooperation of the learner. The acquiring of an ability may simply happen to one, but learning is something which one does, and the doing of it involves something in the nature of thinking, judging, employing concepts. The uses of learn by animal psychologists are against me here, but I do not defer to them as they are utterly at variance with one another. In any case, a simple stipulation is all I need. I want to talk about the acquiring of abilities by means which involves the use of concepts by the acquirer. and I abbreviate this to learning. I think, though, that this stipulative definition squares pretty well with ordinary uses of learning, at least in the human context, which is all I am concerned with in the present section. Hume and Locke provide an illustration. In Hume's account, the acquirer of a concept or idea is entirely passive. He has one or more visual fields, say, which leave behind a faded afterglow, which his idea of redness. This has no more require his active cooperation than does the raising of a blister of his heel by an ill-fitting shoe. Note now, Hume speaks of acquiring a custom, of using words correctly, and of customs as being revived by experience. No such impression of passivity is given by Locke's telling of a comparable story. Locke represents the acquiring of an idea, a process which he calls abstraction, as an activity of the acquirer. What the latter does roughly is to notice that a number of sensory states are alike in a certain respect, and to decide to classify further sensory states according to whether they resemble the original ones in that respect. Locke's account, like Hume's, construes ideas as quasi-sensory states, and there are other faults in it too, but it does have the merit of recognizing that a person may actively participate in his own intellectual development. In my sense of learn, someone who has learned to do something must earlier have had some concepts, whence it follows that not all concepts can be learned. Furthermore, if there are any concepts whose use is required in all learning, negation and totality look eligible. They in particular cannot be learned. Abstractionist accounts of such concepts as negation and totality always have a surrealist air about them. Not because plausible examples of allness and notness are hard to find, but rather because someone who lacks those two concepts cannot do what the abstractionist account requires him to do, namely to notice that all those things share a feature which is not possessed by this other thing. Are concepts like those of totality and negation therefore innate? If innate means possessed but not learned, the answer will be affirmative, but since it means possessed but not acquired, there is no reason to say that those concepts are innate. Some philosophers have overlooked the possibility of acquisition other than by learning, and have thereby tilled the ground in which the dispute over innate concepts flourishes. Locke seems to have argued that because no concepts are innate, therefore all are learned, while Leibniz apparently saw that not all concepts can be learned, and inferred from this that some must therefore be innate, in the sense that they are possessed but at birth in a dormant form, and are somehow awakened or vitalized by experience. Since Leibniz words are inexplicit and metaphorical, any interpretation must be tentative. But I think that his point was that the procedures For concept acquisition with luck, the scribe can succeed only with someone who already has some concepts. This reading is reinforced by Leibniz' rejoinder to the slogan, "There is nothing in the mind which has not force in the sense." To this he replied, "Except the mind itself," which may perhaps be taken to mean except such concepts as are prerequisite for learning anything. As soon as we see that an unlearned concept may be nevertheless have been acquired and therefore need to be innate, we lose all temptation to posit congenital contempts, dormant or not. We can thus avoid both Locke's misguided search for a way of learning the concept of totality and Leibniz's hazardous doctrine that a baby is born with abilities which it is not yet able to exercise. A baby which has no concepts comes to have them, and its gaining of these abilities as to the ability to control its hands can in principle be explained causally, neurophysiologically. This is not an evasion for philosophical theory apart. The only sort of explanation we should expect to find for someone's general level of intellectual capacity is a causal one, and the fact that someone has the concepts of negation and totality, unlike his possession of the concepts of neurosis and democracy, is a fact about his general intellectual level. 8. Transcendental deduction, the main thread. 28. The unity of consciousness. We now turn to the jungle of the transcendental deduction of the categories. Kant's justify discontent with this desperately ill-writing chapter led him to rewrite it for the second edition, but the later version, though it helpfully shifts some emphasis, is only marginally clearer than the earlier. Attempts have been made to canonize the whole text of the transcendental deduction, but the results have been derisible. Far more usefully, Weihinger and Kant'S have explained the unclarity of the first version of the deduction by the conjecture that it is a collage made up of jottings written down over the years. However, this fares as a biographical hypothesis. It is at least backed by some fairly sound critical exegesis. And yet, even if the transcendental deduction is reshuffled in accordance with his patchwork theory, the result, though it shows something like a linear development from primitive to sophisticated attacks on the same problems, it is still dreadfully confused. The deduction is not a patchwork but a botch. Since it contains some good things, however, it is not a negligible botch. My aim in 28 and 31 will be to lay bare certain arguments which are central to the transcendental deduction and from which something can be learned, while relating my remarks as closely as possible to the Kantian text. I shall leave many exegetical problems unsolved, and all the exegetical debates unadjudicated. The transcendental deduction can usefully be seen against the background of a possible empiricist philosopher who takes over Hume's basic epistemological doctrines and develops them into the account of objectivity concepts which Hume himself failed to develop only because he could not see that there is clear water between the Scilla of Berkeley and the Charybdis of Locke. This empiricist argues that the world might at any moment become such that the objects in it cease to obey causal laws, or even such that it will cease to contain durable objects at all. His conclusion that objectivity and causality are at any moment liable to collapse is derived from a pair of premises. 1. There is no logical connection between the content of experience at one time and its content at another time. 2. The possibility that the world should cease to contain objects or cease to obey causal laws is the possibility that certain statements of the form is a sensory event of kind F occurs at T1, then a sensory event of kind G will occur at T2, should cease to hold true. The order lines of our experience is not a reflection of an underlying real causality or objectivity behind the veil of perception. Kant accepts 1, and it is nearer true than false to say that he accepts 2 also, though not quite for the reason that most empiricists would have given before his time, insofar as Hume accepted something like 2. This was because he thought that all our concepts, including those of causality and objectivity, must be derived from our experience, whereas Kant says only that they must be connected to experience, because they will mean nothing were we not always able to present their meaning in appearances. Although he accepts the empiricist's premises, Kant dissents from the conclusion that the objectivity and causal order of the world are in constant jeopardy. This dissent rests partly on his thesis, which he proves in the Principles chapter, that if we are to use any concepts, we must use the concepts of object and cause, not just have this concept, but use or apply them, which can be done only if we have something objective and causally ordered to which we can apply them. If this thesis is correct, then our empiricist must concede that he has erred in representing chaotic experience as convenient rather than as entirely resistant to intellectual control. But he may add that this shows only that total chaos will be nastier than he had realized, not that it will be impossible. I grant that if causal order failed, we could apply no concepts to, have no rational grasp of our experience, but now see how much comfort you have lost and how horridly intractable our experience may, for all you know to the contrary, at any moment become. Kant wishes to show that this nightmare is impossible. He resists the whole skeptical trend of Hume's writings on causality and flatly denies that our confidence in an orderly future is an act of faith or habit of expectation engendered in us by our orderly past. He must therefore wring from our empiricists, and from whom a larger concession than can be forced from him just by the thesis that concepts can be applied only in a causally ordered objective realm. The transcendental deduction aims to extract his larger concession by showing, roughly speaking, that there cannot be experience which is not brought under concepts at all. There is a fashionable fable which presents skeptics and their opponents as respectively sapping and shoring up the confidence of the plain man in the stability and normality of his world. This has strikingly little to do with what actually happens in the pages of the great philosophers, and I will not be thought to encourage it. I have sketched the place of the transcendental deduction in the larger strategy of the critic by treating it as part of a program for showing that a certain alleged possibility is not in fact possible. The point of the program, however, is not to exorcise a Humean spectre, to remove a fear about what might be the case, but rather to illuminate what is the case. If it were proved that there could not be experience which was not brought under intellectual control, this would no doubt be shooting to someone who had been neurotically worrying about the possible onset of uncontrollable experience, if such a person could be found. But it would be illuminating to anyone who cared about the relationship between the experience which we do have and the intellectual control which we do have over it. And there are many people like this. Another way of bringing out the relationship between the transcendental deduction and some of Kant's predecessors, including Hume, will be this. In Hume's philosophy, the sensory and intellectual aspects of the human condition differ only in degree, and just for this reason, Hume must allow that a man might have sensory states which he did not bring under any kind of intellectual control. Such a man will merely be one whose perceptions were all of that degree of vividness which defines the sensory, none of them being dim enough to count as the ideas, which in Hume's philosophy to duty for concepts. Kant, on the other hand, distinguishes sharply between the sensory and the intellectual. He says that facts about a man's sensory intake are toto coelho, different from facts about what concepts a man has. This paradoxically makes it possible for him to argue that sensory intake and intellectual control are necessarily intertwined in a way which Hume never suspected. Kant himself sees the situation in this light. Quote, "Thoughts without content are empty. Institutions without concepts are blind. These two powers of our capacities cannot exchange their functions. The understanding can intuit nothing. The senses can think nothing. Only through their union can knowledge arise. But that is no reason for confounding the contribution of either with that of the other. Rather, it is a strong reason for carefully separating and distinguishing the one from the other. I turn now to the central argument in the transcendental deduction. This is scattered throughout the deduction in A. In B, it is drawn together into 11 consecutive pages. The argument has to do with ownership of mental states. Kant says that mental states or representations can exist only as episodes in the histories of minds. He expresses this by saying that representations must be subject to the unity of a perception or unity of consciousness. Quoting, "The unity of consciousness is a condition under which every intuition must stand in order to become an object for me, for otherwise the manifold will not be united in the consciousness." The passage goes on to say that this is analytic because it says only that, quote, "all my representations must be subject to that condition under which alone I can ascribe them to the identical self as my representations." End of quote. This suggests that Kant's view about the unity of consciousness is just a consequence of the statement that what is mine is mine. In fact, however, he wants to say not merely that all my representations are mine, but also that every representation is someone's. If this is analytic, it's being so dependent upon the meaning of representation or some allied term, not upon the meaning of mine. It is indeed analytic. The word representation is here doing duty for certain more specific terms, of which intuition is the most important. Now, some philosophers have thought that when someone has an intuition, apprehends a sense datum, there are two things involved, a man and a sense datum, with a relation of apprehension between them. And so these philosophers have thought it's sensible to wonder whether a sense datum could exist without having that relationship to anyone. The trouble here is with the reifying premise. Once we replace the model talk of the man as apprehending his sense datum, or his pain, or his thought, by talk of the man as being in a sensory state, or suffering, or thinking, we can see that there is no question to be raised about whether there can be unapprehended sense data. This is one reason for preferring the phrase sensory state. It brings out a sense datum, and intuition and representation do not. The logical similarity between talk about people's sense data and talk about the properties of things. No one will think it's sensible to ask whether there could be instances or redness which did not consist in some things being red. I do not know whether Kant will have given this reason for saying that it is analytic that all representations are someone's. One of the teasing things about the critic is that, although his terminology suggests a propensity for reifying mental states, Kant says clear of the troubles into which reifiers are usually led. He does not inquire into the niceties of the apprehension relation between a man and his intuitions, nor discuss whether a visual sense datum can be read in the same sense as a physical surface can, nor speak of intuition as a visible or tangible or audible. And to come back to the point, he does not think it logically possible that representations should exist except as states of minds. There is a little more than this to Kant's thesis about the ownership of mental states. His use of the word unity embodies his belief that for something to be a state of mind is for it to be unified in a certain way with other items of the same sort. This is not intended to rule out the possibility that there should be a mind which was quantitatively unvarious. Kant will in fact have rejected the extraordinary suggestion that there might be a mind of which nothing was true except its continual preoccupation with a single note of music, but his reasons for that come later. In equating every representation occurs in a mind with every representation is unified in a certain way with other representations. All Kant is assuming is that a mind must have a history, must last for a certain length of time. The unity in which he is interested is, as we shall see, the unity which connects the earlier and the later states of a single mind. Kant says that every representation must occur not just in some mind, but specifically in the mind of a self-conscious or self-aware being. Sometimes he concedes that a representation might exist unaccompanied by self-consciousness, but insists that such a representation will be nothing to its owner. Thus, quote, "It must be possible for the I think to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something will be represented in me which could not be thought at all, and that is equivalent to saying that the representation will be impossible, or at least will be nothing to me." End of quote. Despite the word think, Kant's concern here is with representations generally. There is more to say to the same effect in a letter to Hertz. Quote, "If I had the mentality of a subhuman animal, I might have intuitions, but I should not be able to know that I have them, and they will therefore be for me, as a cognitive being, absolutely nothing. They might still exist in me, a being unconscious of my own existence, as representations, connected according to an empirical law of association, exercising influence upon feeling and desire, and so always disporting themselves with regularity, without my thereby acquiring the least cognition of anything, not even of these my own states." End of quote. The passages just quoted suggest that Kant is armed with an account of awareness, another of self-awareness, and an argument which links the two. This will be formidable equipped indeed, but Kant does not have it, and that is hardly surprising, for there seem to be no good reasons for saying that a dog's visual field, say, is nothing to the dog, or in general for saying that where there is consciousness, there must be self-consciousness. Nevertheless, Kant's insistence upon self-consciousness is well grounded. He hopes to establish a priori truths of the form whatever our experience turns out to be like. It must always have such and such features. His aim is to show of some kinds of experience which are not obviously impossible, that they are unobviously impossible. His strategy then must be to start with the class of not obviously impossible kinds of experience. In example, kinds which one can at least prima facie suppose oneself to have, and to thinning out he can ignore from the outset any kind of experience which we cannot envisage ourselves as having, because nothing could count as knowing that one's experience was of that kind. Now the only states of awareness which I can regard as possible mine, in the sense that I could have them and know that I had them, are ones which include an awareness of myself, and an ability to have the thought that this is how it is with me. This is how it is with me now. Therefore, although consciousness does not imply self-consciousness, the latter must accompany any conscious states which are to fall within the ambit of Kant's inquiry, for that inquiry excludes states which one could not know oneself to be in, and which therefore cannot intelligibly be made a subject for speculation. I wish to circumscribe as clearly as possible the claim I am making. Certainly I might suffer brain damage and sink to a radically subhuman level at which I could no longer have a sense of myself as the owner of my mental states. Furthermore, I can talk about how in such a case I might behave, how my disability might affect others, and so on. What I cannot do is to consider what it will be like for me on the inside, so to speak, if I were thus disabled. We do perhaps have to have the concepts of what it is like for people who suffer such a disability, of what it is like on the inside. This is suggested by our inclination to pity them, and our having a fear of being like them, which is different from the fear of death. But we shall contradict ourselves if we try even to speculate about what it is like for the creature concerned to be in such state. To do this, we should have to tell what could be his story, and this will be to credit him with self-consciousness. We cannot say perhaps something like this would be his story if he were capable of the thought, this is how it is with me now, and we're therefore capable of having a story about himself. For we cannot add the self-consciousness while leaving the rest of the story intact, as thought the disability consistent in X and Epsilon, and as an isolable extra, a lack of self-consciousness. The basis for our denial that the lower animals are self-conscious is the basis for our assessment of their intellectual capacities. The same broad features of their behavior are relevant in each case. See the end of 30 below. This is why, although William Golding can portray the mind of a Neanderthal man and thereby achieve something fine, the supported autobiographies of horses are inevitably as unfit for adult consumption as are tales that attribute personality to shunting engines. So all suppositions about possible experience must concern experience which is owned and which is accompanied, accompanied, accompanied by self-consciousness. It is out of these modest but not trivial asseverations that Kant spins the argumentative thread to the transcendental deduction. Once again, it is necessary to insist that the consolatory aspect of Kant's conclusions does not constitute their point. We can see Kant as addressing himself to one who worries about what his experience might come to be like. Quote, "You cannot suppose that, and thus cannot fear, that your mind that you might find yourself without the concept of yourself as the owner of your mental states. So if I can show that experience which is accompanied by self-consciousness must have feature F, then I will have shown that finding yourself with experience which lacks feature F is not among the outcomes which you can fear." End of quote. But we can also take him to be addressing himself to a philosopher rather than to a neurotic. Quote, "When you tell a story to yourself or to others about the content of your mental history, you are in effect using a distinction between I have a story and my story is as follows. There is nothing wrong with this distinction, but it must be properly understood. In particular, you must not assume that every aspect of your story is a simple matter of fact about the mental history which you happen to have. For there may be some feature of your experience, call it F, such that only experience which has F can be accompanied by self-consciousness, and if that is so, then the fact that your experience has F lies on the I have a story side of the line rather than on the my story is as follows side of the line." End of quote. It is the latter formulation which brings out the kind of interest which the mentally stable might have in Kant's argument. '29. Synthesis. Recall that Kant's aim is to show A, that all experience must have certain features, and B, that all possessors of experience must have certain capacities. The obvious parallel between A and what is supposed to be proved in the Aesthetic is noted by Kant in a passage which I also quote for another purpose. Quote, "The supreme principle of the possibility of all intuition in its relation to sensibility is, according to the transcendental aesthetic, that all the manifold of intuition should be subject to the formal conditions of space and time. The supreme principle of the same possibility in its relation to understanding is that all the manifold of intuition should be subject to conditions of the original synthetic unity of a perception. Insofar as the manifold representations of intuition are given to us, they are subject to the former of these two principles. Insofar as they must allow of being combined in one consciousness, they are subject to the latter. For without such combination, nothing can be thought or known, since the given representations will not have in common the act of the apperception, I think, and so could not be apprehended together in one self-consciousness. Most of this passage concern." End of quote. most of this passage concerns A rather than B, because it says that intuitions must allow of being combined in one consciousness, but the final sentence points to B, for it seems to say that intuitions must be combined, applying presumably that their owner must be able to effect the required combination, whatever that may mean. Kant usually speaks of synthesis rather than combination. The latter word is briefly prominent only in the second edition, but I shall use the two words interchangeably. The passage I have quoted makes it natural to think of combination or synthesis as something like an act of putting together, but Kant also has a different use of synthesis, in which a synthesis is a state of being together. The suggestion is that the outcome of a synthesizing act, is a synthesis, unity or state of togetherness, as the outcome of a mustering of sheep is a mob of sheep. The analogy with the mustering of sheep has its dangers. When Kant speaks of synthesis, unity, he does not refer to physical proximity, but rather to the togetherness, which might be called logical and is certainly not spatial, of different properties of a single object or different states of a single mind. Similarly, when he speaks of synthesis, act of unifying, he does not mean a physical but rather a logical putting together, which indeed he often calls intellectual synthesis. Here is an example of intellectual synthesis. I am aware of the presence of something cold and of something which hums. I consider the criteria for one thing having two properties, probe my surroundings in the light of these criteria, and conclude that the cold thing is the human thing. Perhaps by identifying each with the tuning fork which I see in my hand. Here a state of togetherness or unity has been recognized through an act of intellectual synthesis. In example, by my arriving at a conclusion about how my sensory data relate to certain criteria. Another example, I see and handle a book, and then an hour later I see and handle a book. I wonder whether it is the same book on each occasion, and after reflection and inquiry I conclude that it is. I synthesize the two book appearances by connecting or unifying them as appearances of a single book. The first example concerns different aspects of a thing at one time, while the second concerns aspects of a thing at different times. These examples show that we can as well speak of coming to realize that X and Y are united, and of uniting X and Y. Herding sheep into an enclosure is different from coming to realize that they are there, but the intellectual operation of assigning properties to an object is coming to realize or coming to the conclusion that they are properties of the object. It follows that the state of synthesis which is produced by an act of synthesis is not the state of affairs, which consists in the cold things being the thing which hums, but rather that which consists by my knowing that the cold thing is the thing which hums. My intellectual activity did not bring it about that the tuning fork was both cold and humming, but bid but bid bring bring it about that I knew that this was so. Despite this, Kant sometimes seems to say that intellectual synthesis brings about not just awareness of a unity, but the unity itself. This will give us trouble later on. In the examples above, I am presented with data which are unsynthesized. In example, which I do not know to relate to a single object, and after reflection and inquiry, I synthesize them. In example, conclude that they do relate to a single object, but I may assign several properties to something without enduring a period of agnosticism, which is ended by my coming to realize that, or coming to the conclusion that, for example, I see and feel the pen which is now in my hand. I realize that the thing I feel is the thing I see, but I have not to come to realize this, for at no state did I have the relevant sensory data, while not knowing that they related to a single object. Do I here perform an act of intellectual synthesis? Locke answered this question, or one very like it, affirmatively. He said that in such cases we are tempted to deny that we have done any concluding or interpreting only because we do this sort of thing so constantly and so quick that we cannot catch ourselves at it. The quickness of the understanding deceives the inner eye. This non-empirical stab in the dark is clearly motivated by the assumption that any sort of grasp or understanding of awareness of a unity must have been arrived at by means of intellectual activity. There is, however, at least one kind of unity of which this assumption is false, namely the unity of mental states within one's own mind. I cannot know that a certain mental state exists and wonder whether it is a state of mine or of someone else. I can wonder whose stomach is rumbling, but not whether it is my neighbor or myself who is embarrassed. Again, I may perhaps come to realize that I have a headache, but I cannot come to realize of a given headache that it is mine. If it is given to me that all as a possible subject of thought or discourse, it is given to me as mine. This is what Kant is getting at when he speaks of the unity of consciousness as original. He means by this that one does not arrive at one's awareness of it by applying criteria for mental identity. I do not deem this headache to me by virtue or of some feature of it, or some relationship between it and my other mental state and my other mental states. The unity of consciousness is original or non-derivative because the awareness of it is, quote, that self-consciousness which, while generating the representation, I think, a representation must be capable of accompanying all the representations, cannot itself be accompanied by any further representation. End of quoting. Kant's real point here is not that the I think cannot be accompanied by any further representation, but that it cannot be derived from or asserted in virtue of any further representation. A substitution of abjelated for beglated, which has been suggested, will make this explicit in the German text. Because the unity of consciousness is original, in the above sense, awareness of one's ownership of mental states cannot arise from an intellectual activity, however facile and elusive, of the kind postulated by Locke. Whatever can be done quickly and easily could in principle be done slowly, but nothing could count as laboriously working out of a given mental state that it was one's own. Locke's assumption is wrong for the other kinds of unity as well, even in cases where it makes sense to say that there was an act of synthesis. It is a mistake to think that there must have been one. The fact that I know a good deal about the things which I can now see and feel and hear may be expressed by saying that my sense data are interpreted, understood, and synthesized, but it does not follow that I must have done some interpreting, reasoned my way to an understanding, or performed an act of synthesis. To understand something, an example, to know that the pain I feel is the pain I see, is to be able to give the right answers to certain questions, to make the right moves in solving certain physical problems, and so on. And we cannot prescribe a priori the ways in which such abilities must be acquired. One can know that something is the case without previously wondering whether, and then working out that it is the case. Just as one can be able to do something without previously being unable and then learning to do it. Kant sees that even a very fast act of synthesis will not do in the case of the unity of consciousness, but he does apparently flirt with Locke's assumption that any awareness of a unity must have been arrived at by some sort of reasoning or interpreting procedure, and even with the more extravagant assumption that a unity must itself be somehow created by an intellectual performance. He has, in any case, another reason for wanting to say that awareness of the unity of one's mind, despite its originality, presupposes an act of intellectual synthesis. He hopes to show that self-consciousness necessarily involves intellectual capacity of a fairly high order. And this conclusion seems to be in jeopardy if it be allowed that someone can be aware of his identity as a conscious being without having reasoned his way to this awareness. Kant therefore persists in saying that any state of unity, or at least any awareness of one, is associated with something in the nature of an act of synthesis, and he tries to reconcile this with the original status of the unity of consciousness by saying that the synthesizing act involved in the latter is not empirical but transcendental. There are two utterly different things which this could mean, and Kant makes free use of both without ever saying that they are distinct, taken in such a way that purports to name a kind of intellectual act. Kant's phrase intellectual synthesis embodies a total mistake, taken in another way, in which it does not name an act though it is still connected with intellectual activity, transcendental synthesis is a powerful philosophical tool which really does connect self-consciousness with intellectual capacity. 30. Transcendental synthesis. Taken in the sense in which it represents a mistake, the phrase transcendental synthesis purports to refer to an intellectual act which does not take place in the empirical time series and therefore does not terminate the period during which the data are waiting to be synthesized. If we never catch ourselves performing the synthesizing act associated with the unity of consciousness and are never in a position to say the data are before me but are not yet synthesized, this is only to be expected if the act in question is transcendental, non-empirical, undated. On this genetic interpretation, as I shall call it, transcendental synthesis looks desperately unpromising. For one thing, it shares all the problems of the static when that is taken to describe the atemporal workings of nominal mechanisms. Furthermore, transcendental synthesis is supposed to produce either the unity of consciousness or the awareness of it, and an act of production must presumably predate the achieved product, so that transcendental synthesis must occur before certain times without occurring at any time. Worse still, since the synthesizing act is an operation upon intuitions, the latter must be available before they can be synthesized. The manifold to be intuited must be given prior to the synthesis of understanding and independently of it. Yet, what has driven Kant to posit a transcendental synthesis at all is just the fact that intuitions can be given only in the unity of consciousness and therefore only after the performance of the synthesis. It looks as though a thought, rather than declining to date the synthesizing act, Kant must date in both before and after the first time at which the items to be synthesized are given. Perhaps he will plead that given is ambiguous. There are two forms which this plea might take, depending on whether the outcome of an act of synthesis is taken to be 1. A state of unity of together or togetherness, or 2. An awareness of such state. One might say that before being synthesized, intuitions are given in the sense that they exist. Afterwards, they are given in the stronger sense that someone has them. This will not do, though, for Kant rightly insists that intuitions cannot exist except as states of someone's mind. 2. He might say that before being synthesized, intuitions are given in the sense of existing as states of someone's mind. Afterwards, they are given in the stronger sense that their owner is conscious of them. But that will commit Kant to saying that transcendental synthesis is an intellectual operation which one performs upon data which one does not know that someone possesses. There seems to be no escape for Kant in a plea of ambiguity.